All right, well, I think we'll get started and people can join as they have a chance. Okay. Welcome everyone to the March meeting of the South Sound chapter of the Washington Native Plant Society. I'm so glad you could all join us tonight. I'm Deb Naisland. I'm the chair of the South Sound chapter, and I'm happy to be here. We'll start the meeting with a couple quick announcements and then move right into tonight's feature presentation by Jenny Liou, The Invasion That Sustains Us. It sounds really interesting. I'm looking forward to it. And be sure and stay with us after the presentation. We have some important chapter news to share with you. There will also be an opportunity for everyone to chat and say hello after the presentation. This webinar is being recorded tonight, and I wanted to make sure you all knew that. In the future, it will be on the WNPS website with all the other recorded events. But please be advised, if you use the chat, your name will appear in the recording. So if you do not want your name to appear in the chat or in the Q&A, then don't use those features. Okay. So first we start by acknowledging that the South Sound chapter is within the lands of the Coast Salish people, and we are grateful to them for their past and ongoing natural resource management and native plant stewardship. So coming up in April, of course, is Native Plant Appreciation Month. WNPS will be sponsoring many wonderful webinars, hikes, and of course, there's the poetry contest. So our email subscribers should have received the poetry contest flyer and the submission form last Sunday, just this last Sunday in the email. Please feel free to share these with a school or even a single classroom that you think would be interested in participating. If you have questions, you can contact Gail Sklar at education@southsoundchapterwnps.org. You can also find that on our webpage with a link to her email. So I encourage you all to check out the Native Plant Appreciation Month page on WNPS.org. There are links to all kinds of great events, and check the calendar. We will have 2 or 3 hikes in April, and that are sponsored by the chapter, but other chapters are having hikes. There will be our plant sale, which I'll talk about in a minute. There'll be other plant sales, and it's just an exciting month with lots going on. So check it out. Yes, so coming up soon is the South Sound chapter spring plant sale. So we have not had a plant sale since 2019. So we are really excited to be able to offer a sale this spring. As we've mentioned before, and in the monthly update that you should have received, this sale is going to be different this year. It's going to be online. And our online store will open on March 28th, where you can browse and kind of get your wish list together. There's not a place to do it in the app. You just on your own piece of paper. So it'll be open for browsing March 28th and March 29th. Then at noon on March 30th, we're going to open the store for sales. It will be open through 7 p.m. on April 8th. When you enter the store, you will be asked to pick a pickup time. And so then this will be when you can come to Thurston County Fairgrounds in Lacey, and either on April 22nd or April 23rd, and you will pick up your order there at the fairgrounds. So we're going to get final details and of course the link to the online store out to you very soon. And it will be distributed to all our chapter members and as well as to the public. In order for this sale to be successful, we really need some on-the-ground volunteers to help us with assembling orders, organizing plant deliveries, assembling orders, taking orders out as people drive up to pick up their order. And this will all be at the fairgrounds, again, in the Thurston County Fairgrounds. And we can use volunteers starting on the 19th. The 19th, the 20th, and the 21st is when we're going to be getting things organized on the ground. 22nd, 23rd, people will be picking up their orders. So if you can help us with this, please contact Gail Trotter at volunteers@southsoundchapterwnps.org. So I'll put that email as well as Gail Sklar's email about the poetry contest in the chat in a couple minutes. So, and as always, we have a number of other ongoing volunteer opportunities. Check our webpage if you can join in and lend your energy to these great conservation efforts. They're listed in the monthly update and they're on our website. Okay, so without further ado, I will hand things over to Gail Trotter, our presentations chair, and she will introduce tonight's presentation.
Well, hi, I am very excited. We have Jenny Liou with us tonight, and double special for her because she just achieved tenure at Pierce College. So we might hear a little bit about that, but it's very exciting, I think. This topic is one that's very important to me because I'm learning so much about it. A few years back, I was at Eye on Nature training session, which is Eye on Nature is at the Nisqually Wildlife Refuge, with longer name than that. But they bring students in and we take them on walks and talk about things. But we had a training session, and in that training session, somebody asked about not using the word invasive, and there was the first time I had heard that, and it struck me as different. And what does that mean? And so it was just my first thought about thinking of it in a different way, thinking of it in what context that person was approaching it with, which was a different context than mine. So that became an important thing. And Roxy Giddens had challenged us to think about how we communicate science a few years back. So these have been things on my mind, and but like 2 years ago, Jenny wrote an article and put it in High Country News. And I saw that and I thought, wow, we need to get her to come speak to us because she was addressing some of these issues. So I look really forward tonight to hearing about her journey through this and what she can share with us and challenge us and make us how we might think differently, which I think is a very important thing. So welcome, Jenny.
Thank you so much, Gail. As I think I was telling you before we got started, it's a real honor to be here because ever since I was in college, I would go to Native Plant Society meetings and I would hear all of the speakers. And so now, like this many years after the fact, it's, just such an honor to be on the other side of this. It is, however, a complicated honor because I've been, I think, increasingly asking myself if I actually really believe in the concept of a native plant. And so I think that questioning is going to be at the heart of what I'm sharing with you today. All right, can you all see this? I hope so. So I'm going to be talking a bit about Himalayan blackberries and invasive and nationalist discourses in the native plant conversation. I want to say, like, as we get into this, that I am probably not the most polished presentation giver ever, because I really like to dig in and get my hands dirty and keep thinking about how we can continue to interrogate and shift concepts. And I really love the process of writing essays because of that. They're just always in motion. And so I guess I'm kind of giving this talk in that spirit, which is to say there's a bunch of stuff where I'm like, I don't really know what the answer is. Let's bring this up. Let's grapple with it for a little while, and then we'll kind of move on. So I hope I put things together in an arc that kind of makes sense to us. I think there are some very much loose ends here, because I've been thinking about this for a long time, and there's lots of places where I'm like, oh, there's either so much more to say, or else I don't know what to say about that. I don't have an answer. You know, that's going to be kind of our method here. I am very cognizant that this is a conversation that kind of spans a couple of discourses. There's moments when I feel like I'm talking as a scientist. Long ago, I did a biology degree, worked as a restoration ecologist, worked as a ecological restorationist for the University of California Natural Reserve System, for the Nez Perce tribal fisheries in north central Idaho. And then most recently, I came to the University of Washington, where I was a Northwest Climate Adaptation Science Center fellow in 2019 and 2020. So there's this like scientist part of my brain that wants to talk that way. I'm an English professor at Pierce College, the brand new associate as of a couple hours ago. And then a huge part of my heart goes into my writing projects, which largely center around a kind of combination of these environmental issues and I guess, sort of writing and thinking about Asian diaspora, sort of Asian immigration history. And there's a whole discourse and a whole theory associated with that. So if I say something and some of you are like, but others are like, what is she talking about? Please feel like you can sort of jump in with a question, and please also feel like you could just keep a healthy conversation rolling in the chat. I appreciate that. It's not distracting to me in any way, shape, or form. So with that being said, I think probably many of us are familiar with these words. There's certainly words that were close to my own heart when I started learning about ecology. And it really defined how I thought about everything that I was doing, right? One of the penalties of an ecological education is that one lives alone in a world of wounds. And a big part of that world of wounds was seeing all of the invasive species and the ecological damage, even when all the people around me didn't see it at all. And now when I look back on this quote and learning this in college and being so excited about this at the same time as like I was falling in love with other aspects of the out of doors, I was like climbing and backpacking and whitewater kayaking, and like my whole world was outside, you know. I think about this and I'm reminded of a particular road trip with some friends when it was like early spring and like the mustard was in bloom and everyone jumps out of the car and they're like, oh my gosh, like it's so beautiful, it's springtime. And I was like, that's black mustard, that's an invasive species, like let's go find some wildflowers. And I was like, they have it all wrong, why are they enjoying this? Like, what is wrong with her? There's a field of flowers. And it was just this moment of disconnect that the more I reflect on it, what is now decades after the fact, the more I'm like, I think I might see it their way now, for reasons that I'm hoping we can dig into together. You know, for all of these years, when I thought about it in that kind of Aldo Leopold sense, I was aware that these other discourses were emerging, but I couldn't quite get over that sense of like, but what about the native species that we have to conserve? Like, what about the huge degree to which biodiversity loss is attributed to hybridization? Like all of these concerns, right? The things that we're taught to be concerned about. And so I was always like, okay, and then there's this other social science thing that happens. I don't know what to do with it. Sorry, my dogs are here. But it wasn't really at the forefront of my mind until COVID happened. And as an Asian American, perhaps you can imagine my responses to that, especially like here in the Pacific Northwest and in King County specifically, where COVID began to emerge, right? Like there was this wave in anti-Asian hate, this wave in like anti-Asian suspicion. And if I'm really honest, like with myself, like I have a lot of friends and colleagues in Chinese friends and colleagues, many of whom had traveled over the holiday or traveled for the Lunar New Year. And so there was a sense of like, when this first happened, I was like, like I'm afraid of my own community, right? Like even if we're like, we shouldn't be, we're trying not to be, there was like a very real sense of like, were you just in Wuhan? Some of you were. Like I've spent a lot of time there with my family, I think in a way that is, it's hard to draw that line between practicality and racist or racialized suspicion, right? So that was on my mind already. And then, do you all remember the way that murder hornets started showing up in the news? It wasn't just like, here's an invasive species. It was like the way that it sort of mapped on to what was happening with COVID was almost uncanny, right? Sort of found here in Washington, this like murderous, invasive Asian species, and the response received so much publicity about how we're going to track down and exterminate like the slightest indication of this. And now part of my ecological brain says, oh yes, like absolutely, like that's what you do with giant hornets when they show up in your country. Like I am like very afraid of wasps, like so I get that. But at the same time, I was like, is this all about hornets, or is there this sort of fantasy mapped onto it where we are actually talking about how we wish we could contain, and by we I mean America writ large, we wish we could contain and eradicate COVID and it's sort of like Asian threat, but obviously we can't because there's people involved, so we're not supposed to do or say those things, so we displace them. So that's what got me started writing this article that Gail mentioned for High Country News. And then, as perhaps you can imagine, I was swamped by people who thought the way that I used to think. I've had so many conversations with strangers like, well, what about this species? What about that species? What are you really advocating for? Like, what do you want? And it's caused me to spend the last couple of years thinking long and hard about like, what I really think of invasive species in the abstract when it comes to like critical physical geography and all of these theoretical discourses, but also when it comes to having a say in land management decisions, like what's the right thing to do? So that's something that has occupied a lot of my thought. And that's what really sort of triggered me to start thinking differently about these other issues. I promise this is going to get to blackberries in a minute, but it's a tour to get there. So as I started digging into this, the sort of discourse I knew was there, but I had ignored, I found all sorts of things. I actually realized that High Country News has a long history of covering these kinds of issues and pairing it with absolutely gorgeous art. And so this is an essay, or I guess a sort of piece of speculative fiction published in High Country News 2006, so the better part of 2 decades before my essay. And what this is, it's a story about a bounty hunter, which of course in our sort of American tradition, we should understand this as a story about the American West, but in an intensely racialized one, right? Like, I think Barry Lopez has a book about sort of wolves and the ways in which bounty hunting of wolves coincided with bounty hunting indigenous people, right? And this idea, almost like the sort of twinning I was describing with like Asian Americans and COVID, right? Where you choose the animal and you symbolically exterminate the human population. Or I guess in both of those cases, when it comes down to it, not so symbolically attempt to exterminate the human populations, right? So we're in this world, we've got this bounty hunter, and the story kind of follows the bounty hunter through like all of these sort of like levels of sort of deceit, where he's trying to sort of make a living in this sort of dystopian future when there's no water. People are really concerned that invasive tamarisk are sucking up the last little bits of water people need. So there's a bounty on tamarisk. People are going out and hunting them up, and they're running out of tamarisk because people are eradicating them in order to get the bounty, right? So wow, right? Like this is a sort of racial allegory, loud and clear, linking together the way that we are currently managing an invasive plant with a long history of racialized bounty hunting and extermination in America. So this is one of the pieces I found where I was like, oh, this is the story that I'm interested in sort of tapping into here. Something I want to draw your attention to here is that this story is not overtly about Asian racialization of plants or anything like that. But if you look at the style of artwork, which is, I think, only heightened when you look at other sort of images from that High Country News publication. I don't know how many of you watch anime. A huge part of my life goes down that particular rabbit hole. But as soon as I saw these, the way that the article was illustrated, I was like, oh, this is anime. And in particular, it draws on this sort of Japanese artistic style that was used in some shows that very much have this sort of questing, searching, trying to like find and extinguish something. And in the case of this show, so these are two graphics from two shows by the same creators, Samurai Champloo and Cowboy Bebop. So I thought I could like see your comments in the chat. I can't see the chat at all. So Gail, please, feel free to chime in if folks are saying stuff that we want to include here. But Cowboy Bebop in particular is about a futuristic Asian intergalactic bounty hunter. And the more I realized what was going on here, I was just sort of like, oh, that High Country News article is kind of like the Cowboy Bebop riff on tamarisk eradication. So I think there's a sort of long and interesting history of thinking about these things together. There's a large body of critical theory, like really kind of like abstruse argumentation about this as well. But I was like, I'll share the piece of speculative fiction with the pretty pictures because this looks nice on a slide. But there's a lot more where this came from if this is something that interests you further. And I've put some further reading at the end of this talk. Okay. So from there, let's talk about blackberries. Part of what got me thinking about blackberries is that as I started thinking about Asianness and native plants, I started thinking like, you know what? Himalayan blackberries are kind of, they're a model minority, right? And the reason their sort of history in America is not all that dissimilar from the history of like several Asian racial formations in America. Like I'm half Chinese. My dad is a nationalist Chinese immigrant. So Taiwan to China to the US, and here I am. I've been sort of like very dialed in to the history of Chinese in America. And I'm thinking like, oh, right? I'm sure we all know why Himalayan blackberry was brought here. It was brought here as a food plant. It was brought here because it was resilient. It was brought here because of those delicious berries. It was brought here probably for exactly all of the reasons that we struggle with it as an invasive. And of course, this isn't unique to Himalayan blackberry. We could say the same thing for tamarisk. We could say the same thing for so many invasive species. Right, it was brought here for a certain kind of ecological labor. And then it turns out that some of the sort of stereotypical characteristics that made it a quote unquote good laborer have turned it into a problem. So from this perspective, I was like, okay, like, I've spent a lot of time working as a river restorationist, which I feel like is just a code for saying I've spent a whole lot of time like hacking Himalayan blackberry and other plants like out of eroded riverbanks, right? So this is not a plant that's always been a friend of mine in that concept. But I think I began to feel a little bit of kinship with it. And then there's this other dimension of the plant where, you know, I'm from northern Idaho, went down to California for school, moved back up the coast. I'm joining you from Tacoma today. And so the sort of core range for this plant is, you know, sort of largely coterminous with my own little chunk of the United States. And because of this, like I've always thought of this as feral food. Like ever since I was a little kid, I'm sure this is the case for many of you as well. Like I would go down to the railroad tracks outside of town, or like go down to the Clearwater River, or just go to abandoned road cuts and just like eat blackberries by the handful. This picture here is actually really close to my house. This is on the Green River. Kind of near Black Diamond. So just, you know, just paddling over to the banks and just knocking like all of these berries onto my kayak and just eating them. It's fantastic. And maybe like I had the additional conflicted joy of thinking like, oh, I am being a good ecologist because these are invasive. I'm doing no harm. I'm doing my tiny little bit of performative weed abatement by spending a day feasting on the river. I think that's what I wanted to say about this slide. Oh yeah, so that was my sort of like, oh, I like thinking about this plant a little bit. I probably don't think about it that hard. I haven't pushed my thinking about blackberry very much because why would I? And then some of you may remember this. I think probably our real life existence, hopefully for some of you, is more separate from your online existence than mine. I have 2 small children. I was pregnant through, you know, much of the pandemic. So I was extremely bored and was on Facebook and other social media way too much. So it really caught my eye because I was thinking about invasive species and I was thinking about blackberries just because I was feasting on them when this controversy kind of flared up in the Washington Native Plant Society Facebook group. And I want to say about the evidence that I'm posting here, I want to explain to you evidence. I want to explain to you where I got this. Someone posted something in that group about salmonberry being a thug. And I was like, oh, that's fascinating. But I didn't really understand what would follow. So I didn't like screen cap it or anything. I was just like scrolling right along, right? And then as like the day went by, the comments exploded. And some of it got really ugly, and this whole conversation kind of ended up being deleted, and perhaps rightfully so, because I guess I wish it existed somewhere. I'm not about silencing these things, but a lot of the language became like appalling. And then people who know that I write about this kind of thing forwarded me screenshots, and I was just like, oh gosh, this is so fascinating. Not to sort of fan the flames of the controversy or blame anyone. Like I do want to condemn every last little bit of the racism that shows up here, but I'm not showing these things to you to be like, look at the racism. I'm showing these to you to say like, where is this coming from? How can it help us sort of understand the contours of this conversation? And this quote seems like it's supposed to be inflammatory. The ones I have on the next page, I don't think are meant to be inflammatory. They're from someone who's like, I don't understand like how something that I say about a plant could actually be racist, because plants don't have races, right? So I was just sort of like, I disagree with these comments. And a lot of the thinking I started doing since then came out of my resistance to them. Like, why? From a theoretically consistent perspective, why did I have such a problem with this? I actually tried to do the talk without this quote because I was like, I don't want this on the page. But I tried to run this by a few people and they're like, we don't understand what you're saying. They had no idea what kind of situation I was referring to. So I ended up saying like, okay, I'll just put this language on the page for you. I hope you can see that it's not really about native plants at all. This is what I could only describe as white nationalism occupying or sort of like commandeering a native plant conversation. But it is language like this that really started to make me question, like, do I believe that the concept of a native plant is a good thing? Am I okay with that word native, or has it been sort of co-opted by these nationalist conversations that I think are sort of like deeply problematic when it comes to the way that we're talking about race in America? So there's just this idea here that non-native species are overcrowding other things. They're stealing resources. It's like very clearly sort of lifted from a, like, you know, a racialized human immigration conversation about like stealing jobs. What? And then the sort of language about borders, misspelled, but still borders, and the need to keep invasive plants on the far side of a border. And I bring this up because some of what I'm going to share with you on the upcoming pages has to do with borders. Okay, so here are the other moments I want to draw your attention to that I hope will lead us into a little bit more nuanced conversation. So just to be clear on sort of like how this happened, someone was talking about salmonberry being a thug, and then there was this, you can't call them that, you can call them that, you can't call them that. And then it got into this whole conversation about like, well, what does it mean to like call a plant a thug? And some people started saying, hey, there's all of these other plants that are thugs. This isn't racialized language. And then it got to like, well, trailing blackberry, another native plant, is also a thug, a description of how it's a thug, how it takes over and kills trees. I don't know. But there was also this moment, which I was like, aha, like, I feel like this is a really sort of useful summary of, I think, where a lot of us are at. Whoops, what have I done? Where a lot of us are at, maybe even if we don't want to sort of admit it out loud, when it comes to our sort of ability to articulate why what we have to say about a native plant might be racist or racialized. So for this term to be offensive, my salmonberries would have to be black. I want to focus on this part. Last time I checked, plants didn't have skin color. I'm like, okay, like, I think that's going to be the connection that we have to make here, right? Like, what's the connection between racism and plants if plants don't have skin color? And I hope we can also dig a little bit into what this word thug means and why it would be problematic in this concept. Okay, so what does it mean to call a salmonberry a thug? And specifically, what does it mean to call a salmonberry a thug? This is, I think, the sort of theoretical crux of what I want to ask here. What does it mean to call an indigenous plant by an anti-Black slur while likening its behavior to an Asian invasive plant that we all love to hate? I think most of us feel like it's a-okay to eradicate and complain about Himalayan blackberry. Okay. So to kind of walk us through some of what's going to follow and the way that I'm going to describe it, I wanted to bring a few terms to the table. So if we're talking about settler colonialism, we're talking about the way that one group would colonize another population with the aim of replacing the original population with the new population, and frequently erasing the traces of the original population and insisting on the new population's nativeness. I hope, I told you there'd be lots of doors we could potentially walk through here. I hope the door that we might think about walking through here is, well, what's the difference between a native plant and an indigenous plant? And I think a lot of us would be like, well, they're the same thing. And I think that this idea of settler colonialism might help us tease those things apart. Which plants have been sort of accepted by, I guess, sort of white colonial America as the nativeness that we want to protect, versus which plants, which are sort of like, you know, equally longstanding in America, have we sort of like cast out, like they're not the nativeness we want to protect, even if they are in fact what we now term native species. They are threatening either other native species or the plants that humans have chosen to cultivate. So I think that's a sort of really interesting idea, and it is frequently settler colonialism is the framework I think that a lot of people are using to critique the way that we talk about invasiveness in our ecological conversations, even if they're not calling out that framework by name. A sort of related topic, the homestead doctrine or the homestead principle is the belief historically supported by law that one owns property by improving it, and that therefore indigenous populations who did not make settler colonial improvements to the land had no claim to it. So part of the logic here is that these longstanding American plants that don't necessarily fit the vision of what human cultivators find aesthetic or useful, or maybe they do, like Himalayan blackberry was useful, but it turned out that it became difficult to control, right? So something that somehow finds itself out of that sort of like easy domestic aesthetic classification ends up being like, well, that's not improved, like that's wild, that's not cultivated by man, so that doesn't even count as anything, like that gets erased. And for us to think about like, what happened in this conversation where salmonberry became a bad guy instead of a native plant that we sort of attempt to sort of protect and cultivate? How did that happen to trailing blackberry as well? And what can this sort of settler colonial discourse help us to untangle there? I think, you know, the term thug is a term with a complicated history and a history related to colonialism. I think really sort of understanding the dimensions of this term is something that'll like help us to understand like why it was such a problem in that context. So the term is frequently used to denote a violent person or a criminal. It's also used in a blanket sense as an anti-Black term. I don't know why this says the term. That would be a typo. I was thinking very hard about this and kept changing it, so my apologies. I was trying to write that the etymology of the term is Indian, where it referred to a gang of murderers and robbers from perhaps 13th century onward. But by the 1830s, the term began to refer to Indians who resisted and opposed British colonial rule. So it has like long had the sort of valence of the term where it's meant to be an insult, but it's an insult that has sort of been appropriated by the resistance. They're like, well, yeah, like if you want to resist British colonial rule, then maybe, you know, this is a sort of like badge of honor, right? And I think we can all sort of track the way the term is used in America and recognize that it is similarly both an insult, a racialized insult, and at the same time it's a word that that some people use with pride. The fact that it's okay in some contexts, I would argue, doesn't reduce or mitigate the degree to which it remains a racialized slur. Okay, so I said that there's a large body of sort of like political theory and I guess just sort of like the history of immigration that we need to talk about to sort of understand this. I am trying to narrow it down, I think by using one source to help us through some of this. So I've got a few questions that I'm going to try to, prompt us to think about here. So why and how has it seemingly become more acceptable to discriminate against Asians than against other racial formations in America? What does this have to do with the way that we talk about native and invasive plants? Both tamarisk and Himalayan blackberries, which would be the two examples that have come up today, are native to Asia or Eurasia. You know, the murder hornets I was working on in that last project, also an Asian species. But of course we have invasive species in America from all over the place, right? So I hope we keep in mind related questions about how the dynamics of other racial formations affect the ways we talk about and manage other non-native species. So a really concrete example of this question, like how might we talk differently about pampas grass than we talk about Himalayan blackberries or tamarisk? Okay, so to the very confusing rescue here. Eco Day has a book called Alien Capital that has a lot to do with the way that Asians in North America, and I'm saying North America because he's writing from primarily a Canadian perspective, Asians in North America have labor, are sort of, their labor vanishes, right? At the same time as we think of like Chinese railroad workers or like this sort of like really intensive Asian labor, I think we could think, you know, in our current times, like, you know, all the big news during COVID is all of these like Asian healthcare workers, whatever else it is, right? We have this like Asians doing a lot of heavy lifting in America, and then that disappears. What does that mean? Why does it happen? How did it happen? And it's not just that their labor vanishes, it's also that the ways in which Asians were discriminated against to begin with become invisible. So here Day is talking about how, well, you know, if we're talking about anti-Black or anti-Indigenous hate in the United States, oftentimes it's couched in this language of like bloodlines, right? The logic of exclusion, where we're saying like, okay, like, yeah, you know, like, well, I mean, think about like blood quantum in the Indigenous conversation, or the sort of colorism that historically and in our current day happens in sort of Black dynamics in the United States, right? And then say, is that what happened to Asians? Like, not so much. And Day argues that the reason this happens is because in America's history, like Asians, it's not that we regulated like their bloodlines once we were in the country, which it's that we stopped Asian immigration at the border. Right. But for a long time, we let Asian laborers into the country. And then we said, okay, so we're not going to stop Asian laborers from entering, but we're going to stop Asian reproduction from happening in America. We don't want the Himalayan blackberry situation. We don't want the plant we don't want the plant that can spread. We don't want the plants that can put down roots. We want to find a way to control immigration at the border. Right. How did this happen in the US? There's actually Lisa Liou has a whole book. It's called Immigrant Acts. It's a big book. It's a big book. And it goes through the history of all of this. If I'm trying to put it instead of like a couple sentences on a couple slides, there's two big moments here in sort of Chinese history. The Oriental Exclusion Act of 1875 ostensibly forbid Asian prostitutes from coming to America. And you might be like, what's the problem with that? Well, the problem with that is that it effectively ended the immigration of Asian women altogether, because there was the potential, I mean, I guess it became the practice to classify almost every potential Asian immigrant as a potential prostitute who is therefore barred from entry. So the idea here was, well, you know, we can have like male Asian laborers, but that's it, right? So, and then in 7 years later, the Chinese Exclusion Act prohibited the immigration of all Chinese laborers. This wasn't repealed till like well until the 20th century, like 1943, I believe. And when the Chinese Exclusion Act was repealed, it was replaced with like a quota of approximately like 105 Chinese immigrants a year. So think about the population of America, think about the population of China, like that is almost nothing. And a lot of people a lot of scholars would argue that this actually sort of increased anti-Chinese discrimination as opposed to ameliorating it in any way. Okay, so kind of back to Day's argument here. So he is talking about, I want to bring up this idea here of racial exclusion versus racial elimination, because I think this is something that really pertains to our sort of like invasive species management strategies, even if we don't always say so. So exclusion we can all think of exclusion strategies, right? Like you've got a checkpoint where you can't bring foreign fruit into California, or you've got like customs, like when you're like arriving from you're arriving from another country, or at a smaller scale, you are you are going to put your boat into a different watershed, and there's lots of places where it's like you actually have to stop and have your vessel inspected to make sure you're not transporting invasive mollusks or something like this, right? So that's the logic there, versus elimination, which is like you've got your tamarisk and you go out and you hack it down. You've got your blackberry and you I guess hack it down again to sort of repeat the phrase. So I think, in our current day, Asian immigration policies have to some degree eased. We have like large Asian American communities in the United States, and they're now subject to both these logics of exclusion and elimination. So it's not a mutually exclusive thing. It's just that in the sort of history of these terms, there was a long period in American history in which Asian discrimination largely took the form of exclusion. And because of this, it just didn't look so bad, right? Like it didn't, yes, like people like Asian Chinese railroad workers were sometimes lynched and beaten and like given like the worst possible jobs and like robbed blind. Like these things did happen, but maybe not like on the same scale as indigenous extermination or obviously like slavery in America, right? We had a different situation where it was mostly like, well, you can't come to this country at all, and we're not going to talk about it. And this set up a dynamic that persists to this very day, where I think many Americans feel like Asianness is the wedge. You can say these anti-Asian things, even about plants, and you can totally get away with it, right? And that doesn't mean to set up a comparison, who's the worst off here amongst the minorities. It's more to suggest that like maybe this is a wedge. And anti-Asian hate is so acceptable. And I think this is something that's been in the news a lot in the context of COVID. Asian American hate is so acceptable that it's sort of the insidious way that these logics of exclusion and more recently elimination make their way into ecological conversations in a way that sort of feels acceptable. Like we'll hear these things, even me, like a Chinese, I guess, what am I, I'm a second generation immigrant. My dad immigrated here, right? I know my history, like I'm a humanities person. I know what this is about. And still for decades, I was like, oh, this is fine, right? How does that happen that we can hear these phrases, hear this language of invasiveness, hear this language of extermination even, and not say, what does that have to do with human genocide? So that's what I'm really hoping Day can help us think about. Again, that book is Alien Capital, if anyone is just, eager to delve into this in more detail. I think what I'm hoping we'll take away from this today is that Asian exclusion is similar to the discrimination, what have I done, faced by other groups. Maybe it seemed, I'm sorry, let me try to back up here. But Asian exclusion appears to be more benign and opens the door to these, what we would mostly consider to be genocide. Okay, so I think that's kind of where I wanted to leave off with the sort of like political theory dump. And I wanted to like bring some conclusions to us. And then my hope, I see some things going on in the chat and stuff. I'm hoping, I'm a recursive thinker. I'm hoping we can go back through some of these remarks and start talking about like what all of us think about all of this and how we might navigate some of these difficulties. So I think the takeaways here, human language and ecological immigration, human and ecological immigration cannot easily be separated in the way that we talk about them. They shouldn't be. For a long time, I was fine with the idea that, well, science is a specialized language. Words mean different things in science than they mean in the world at large, right? This is one of Kuhn's central contentions in, I think, a really famous book in the history and philosophy of science, his Structure of Scientific Revolutions, where he talks about the specialized scientific language. We all know what this looks like, and we think we're like in the know because we agree with this. Like if someone says like, well, I don't believe in evolution because it's just a theory, we're like, that's not what theory means, right? Let me explain what theory means to you in a specifically scientific context, right? And we would say, oh, well, that's not what invasiveness means in an ecological context. Invasiveness refers to this much narrower thing. It refers to the behavior of a plant. We have to deal with this in a really sort of clinical way. So I used to believe in those divides. I believe in them less and less these days. And it's a really difficult thing to navigate as someone who is sort of half my life is immersed in language and the other half is immersed in resource management, right? How do we balance those two things? And I'm really hoping that even if we don't have the same answers here, we can all think about how we'll balance those things against each other. I have no idea what the answer is, right? And the big picture, I'm like, what we need is an overarching shift in the way that we think about disciplinarity, right? We're so accustomed to cordoning these conversations off and saying, well, that's how writers think, that's how scientists think. That's totally fine if those groups aren't in conversation with each other. And that leaves us with some real disjunctiveness. So I think, one of the things that I was like, oh, this seems like a barrier that people are running up against in that Facebook explosion, right? Some people saying this is racist and some people saying, no, it's not, and not a sort of deeper digging into what that looks like. So I'm hoping what I'm starting to model for you here is this sense of okay, it's not as simple as something being racist, because obviously there are many different racial formations in America, many of which have been subjected to very specific kinds of racism, or at least racialized interaction with the other racial formations, or other sort of groups of ethnicities in America, right? So if we talk about well, what does it feel like to be an Asian American watching this conversation unfold around these Asian invasive plants? What does it feel like to be an Asian American watching these plants that just happen to fall into the same genus, but they're native to this place, right? And it seems like they're getting maligned because we've decided to malign blackberries as a whole, and all of the ways in which Himalayan blackberries are frustrating. Well, salmon berries, and perhaps to a lesser degree, trailing blackberries, are also frustrating, right? So the Asian invasive species appears to have sort of spearheaded the dislike that people felt free to discuss, express about the entire genus of plants, right? So what happened there? How did that work? And then I can't help but ask myself, and ask my friends who belong to different racial formations, well, what is this like for you to watch this unfold from your investments, from your perspectives, from your lived experience? What is it like to watch people have this conversation? What racialized sensitivities does it connect you to? What parts of this would we want to change and avoid? I think people, at least when I've had this conversation with people, they've given me wildly different answers, ranging from this doesn't bother me at all to answers that are really specific to their own culture or their own positionality. So I'm hoping we can add some nuance to that conversation. And I think in the big picture, I'm hoping that each of you can think about the ways that we can bring these questions into our own ecological thoughts and practices, and to feel like this is a conversation that we can have with our friends. If you want to annoy your ecologist friends, with your family members, with your colleagues, even at a point where we feel like we're not sure where we personally stand, we don't really know what the correct path forward is. I think that the only way we're going to start to break this down is to be a little bit willing to reside in the chaos, reside in that uncertainty with language. And I think, as you've heard me talking today, I say that I have a problem with these words and I keep using them. I put them in air quotes, but I'm still using them. And the reason I'm using them is because we don't really have an alternate lexicon here that is sort of widely adopted. We don't have another way of talking about ecological communities and immigration and the shifting dynamics here. We just have this one language that we've all agreed to use. If I use something else, you would be, because I could say, okay, I'm going to bring in the way that we talk about immigration in Asian diasporic literature, right? And then all of you would be like, what is she saying? Even more so than I think many of us probably feel like a little bit like, oh, what is Eco Day saying? What is that all about? It doesn't seem to have anything to do with plants, right? So what do we do in this space where we don't have a language that corresponds to the change that I think many of us are beginning to sense is necessary? And how is that language change going to happen if we're kind of stuck using the same words, even as we recognize their problematics? Okay, so I'm hoping that we can kind of other people can jump in here. Yeah, I see a bunch of stuff in like the chat and a remark in the Q&A. Gail or others, what works best here? Like, I mean, should I just leave it in the screen share so that everyone can see stuff? And Gail, do you want to ask those questions?
Yeah, I'll go through the questions. One thing I'll just throw out, some people are asking about your contact information. So if you are willing to share that, you might put that in the chat so that if they wanted to connect with you some more, they could.
Oh,
Does that sound okay? And then why don't you leave this up? Because sometimes people ask questions and it's like, go back to, a certain screen. So we will do that. There has been amazing things happening in the chat. I'm going to start with the question that's in the Q&A, and then I'll work my way up through the chat. A lot of them are comments that this has been a beneficial discussion, a launching of a discussion that others have found that they've wondered about, they've questioned about, and things like that. So, Zizi, oops, oh, the question went away.
oops.
So,
I think if you go to answer, I messed it up because I put my email.
Oh, in the Q&A. Okay. Okay, I'm going to get back to it. Thanks so much for this. I really think people feel powerless about the ecological gravity that we are facing, and are used to and are used so-called invasives as scapegoats. As someone who works in restoration, I try to be a different kind of dialogue with plants that have to remove sometimes than the typical hateful approach that conservation has. I wonder what approaches that you have found that feel better when you're engaging with a non-native species. Sorry for the but the question is good, so
yeah. I'm laughing about my somewhat bad person response to this. I love the question, and oftentimes I don't know. We all have our scapegoats here. I have my scapegoat. I knew him so long ago. I worked with him so long ago that I've forgotten his name, which is for the best for all of us. But I used to work for the California State Park Service, and in coastal California. And so we had to do a lot of tamarisk abatement. And I had a coworker who, when it was his turn to do this, and he was someone who like had maybe questionably sort of white nationalist views anyways. And it was a weird situation because he worked in this office, and then our supervisor was Mexican American, and then of course like I was Chinese American, so there was that sort of dynamic going on in the group. And our coworker would dress fully in a white Tyvek suit, would like put on, like, you all know the like the Roundup backpack pump things, right? So he would like put all this on, and we'd be like, okay, like whatever, so far so good, we all do that. And then before he went out to like do his tamarisk spraying, he would just shout, kill, 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 while doing like what I can only describe as a sort of like Nazi march around our office. And we were like, what is happening? Like every time this happened for as long as I worked there. And that was one of those moments where I think I told you there are moments when I kind of like break through the Aldo Leopold veneer, right? Where I'm just sort of like, well, this clearly is not okay, but maybe it's just this dude, right? And he is always in my mind when I talk about these things, because I think my answer to this question would be, I'm always thinking about how not to be that guy, right? Like, what is there, like, I don't know, like, is there a way to eradicate a species with a certain degree of sort of like multi-species respect? Do we call that eradication? What do we do with it instead, right? I think I have no idea what to do about tamarisk. Like, that's a whole other situation, and it's one that's really captured the imagination of the people who talk about this kind of critical invasion studies, right? But I think part of what my attention gets called to, like, so when I worked for the University of California Natural Reserve System, I worked in a freshwater marsh, and it was full of food plants, right? So you'd like try to drive down the roads to like manage different parts of the marsh, and you like couldn't, because suddenly there would be like a chard that had grown so high that you like couldn't drive over it, or at least I couldn't, because I had a Corolla, and it would like, you know, like scrape my undercarriage and like catch my car on fire. So I'd stop and be like, well, I've got dinner, harvest it. I can't even tell you how many meals I've had while working in that nature reserve. Like, so many food plants have become, quote unquote, our most insidious invasives. And I, you know, I mean, maybe we can't eat every head of chard that shows up on the landscapes we manage, but I would almost describe it as this just sort of like, at least we honor their original intent. We honor these plants as food. We honor their ecological labor. I feel like I sound really hokey when I say this, but I actually like raised this with some colleagues. And now if I find this, I maybe can send this out to you, Gail. But there was in fact someone of a similar mindset who, I'm a terrible cook. I'm like, I'll have some raw chard while I'm like on my lunch in the field, right? But there was a chef of a similar mindset who started a restaurant that utilized like solely these sort of salvaged invasive plants, right? And so I think there's a way to kind of bring that mindset to all of this. I feel like I can't help but put on my sort of philosophy brain when we talk about this, but there are a lot of sort of recent conversations about I guess what I would describe as animism, like in indigenous contexts. Like, I think big news, right? The why have I suddenly forgotten the name of the tribe? The Klamath tribes according personhood to the river, right? And this idea that like a river can have the same standing as a human being could. There's a discourse growing up around sort of like, well, like what would it be like to be a plant? Right. And then there's also a book that's really sort of close to my thinking and to my heart, is by a theorist named Mel Chen. It's called Animacies. And it is really about sort of the way these sort of like racialized and gendered discourses get mapped onto objects. A plant, a rock, whatever else it is, right? So, you know, at the risk of sounding hokey, I do think like having these conversations and thinking about these things, even if it doesn't immediately go out and change like what it is we do to quote unquote, you know, do our jobs managing some of these species, I think it helps us, it helps me to be a different kind of person while I'm doing this work. I don't want to just answer these questions in the chat, please, if you or just unmute or whatever it is, if you have better answers than mine, because this is one of the things where I'm just like, I don't know. Like it's a huge problem. I think it's tied into the whole way we think about nature, and with some of these other problems, climate change as well, right? We're like, what can one individual person do? I don't know. How do you make these bigger changes happen? I don't know. How can we live our lives so that we can live with ourselves? Maybe that's where we start to make these changes.
I think you're echoing many sentiments that are in the chat. So I'll just kind of go through a few of them. So Ben Alexander is talking about he's doing a talk tomorrow, and he had one page in his slideshow that is about this topic, and he's thinking about how he might try to connect in that one slide with the rest of his talk. And he's been considering this for the past 4 or 5 years. So this is very important. And there's several other people who have mentioned some training that's gone on through Earth Corps, and they also have been, others have been noticing that same over the last 2 years, this kind of importance of considering the words we use, and how it's especially kind of been highlighted by giving something a title and then taking it down a path that might not really be what was intended in the beginning. Let me see. There aren't specific questions, but there is just a lot of comments. At the very beginning, people were saying how much this was much more than what they thought it might be as far as a presentation. So I think you've hit the mark with challenging us of ways to think. And there's also some books, and Jenny, I'm going to save this chat and I'll send it to you, because there were some books and some references to some areas in Tacoma that people were putting in the chat.
Oh, perfect. Oh, I have some books too.
Oh, great. Excellent.
As you can see from, this is just a small scattering, but I think one thing that you'll see here is that Duke University Press is like way into this. I've been like just ordering stuff that seems relevant, kind of following the breadcrumbs from one thing to the next, and be like, oh, these are all Duke University Press. I did the super tacky thing and I gave you the link to my thing here, right? But High Country News has been following this in like at a really deep level for a long time. So I don't know. Duke University Press, High Country News, they're kind of like my sort of touchstones here, although I don't know. If anyone else wants to talk about this too, I'm like, I will read what you sent and email me and let's talk about it, because I feel like this is all I've been reading about for like a couple of years now, and it's so interesting, and I'm doing it mostly in solitude, so I appreciate all of those suggestions.
I did put your email in the chat. I copied it out of the Q&A because I never understand Q&A. It seems to disappear, and so I just copied that up there since you had provided it. Let me see. We got more comments coming in. Let's see. It's Jean sends a comment. She goes, maybe we can lighten up on tidiness. Deer love blackberries and we can love them too. And let's see. And somebody else mentioned that they like Duke Press. Yay. So it's another one for us to watch. Okay, so Ben's now asking a specific question. Thank you, Ben, because it's hard for me to rattle off these things. But anyway, his specific question is how to acknowledge that the language that we use for ecology or ecological restoration may have inadvertently racist biased messages without triggering a cascade of defensive reactions.
I don't know how to answer that because I have triggered a cascade of defensive reactions. I mean, I guess that's my joking answer. I think maybe the most candid answer that I can sort of give here from my perspective might be I think to acknowledge our own vulnerability and to not kind of call I guess this is what I was thinking about when I was putting this together today, because I was kind of like, oh my gosh, what if someone who made one of those posts is in this meeting? What if lots of people like share this perspective and I'm like angering people? I see this as a learning process for all of us. I think it really helps to talk about our own learning process, to talk about the ways in which the places we are at right now are sort of uncertain and evolving and messy. I know this is very much the case for me. As I was like going through slides, I was like, oh my God, like there are typos. And I'm like usually a like meticulous proofreader. And the reason that there are typos is because I've been working on this for so many months and I was still changing it at like 5:30 today because I don't know what I think about all of these things. I don't think most of us know what we think about all of these things. I was like on the phone with one of my colleagues that, you know, we spend a lot of time like thinking through these things together. And he was asking me questions and I was like, I don't know. Let me change. That's, you know, for me, these things are not hard and fast. It's a sort of like conflict within my own mind. I 100% understand where these other perspectives are coming from. I've like held those other perspectives dear for a lot of my own life. I think this may sound tacky, but I almost put this at the beginning of the talk, but then I kind of like held off on it. Like I have like specific close friendships that I made around Aldo Leopold's book, like a bunch of climbing buddies where we'd read it around the campfire and we were all like studying like restoration biology together. And all of these years later, I think out of that close group of people, right, I might be the only one who has done a 180 on my views there, right? So I guess I don't see this as sort of engaging an enemy here. It's you know, to some degree, it's a conversation with who I used to be and how I used to think, and to some degree, it's a really open question about how all of us could shift our thinking in the future.
I agree that this is the beginning of a conversation, a beginning of a way to look at, you know, how to maybe rethink some of the things that we think are just given, you know, facts or something like that. And maybe we need to look at other perspectives, and having the conversation, I think, is important. Right. So Gail Sklar is asking, can she share your contact information with another committee that she's on in the Native Plant Society?
Oh yeah, sure. Like I said, I love to think about these things, you know, alongside whoever else wants to have these conversations. So yeah, please.
Right. Okay, good. So Gail, I put it in the chat. And again, we can save it. And if you want me to send it to you later, I can. So I'm hoping I haven't missed anybody's comment that,
If I think we're a little shy of our 90-minute mark, because I was like, people are going to want to talk about this. I have to curtail it. But I think there's
No.
so many open doors in these
Yes.
slides. I think if there's anything else that anyone wants to chat about, I'm happy to sort of revisit things.
Yes. Right. Okay. I think I've covered most of the broadness of the comments. Oh, here's a question. Okay. So how does a person talk about the problems that some plants are without? No, wait. I'm sorry. I'm such a bad reader. So how does a person talk about the problems that some plants are without someone else thinking that there are deeper meanings involved? It sounds like the language is a problem, not necessarily the intent. How do we talk without others acting in such adding such connotations?
Okay, so I think I used to. It's part of my mind does still think like, okay, so there's like the practices, and then there's the language, like that's sort of layered onto that. I guess I'm not sure that those things are so separate anymore, which doesn't mean I have a good a good answer to that. But I'm thinking, as I'm sure all of us can imagine, about, okay, like, I mean, what are some of the most sort of like immediate practical problems that quote unquote invasive species pose, right? Like, I'm thinking of one that, oh, I've been writing about this in a different a different project as well, so I will like bring this up. This is the sort of quote unquote invasive species that is like blowing my mind the most at the moment. Castor beans, right? That's a problem. Is this some, I don't know if this is something that a lot of people in this group think about a lot. I don't know, like, it really okay, so you have this invasive species, like almost ubiquitous in the American West, grows along all of those road cuts in places that, it's super accessible to whoever wants it. It can be like distilled into like an incredibly potent poison, and in order to do this, I mean, don't like probably Google this if you don't like want to be on like terrorist watch lists or something, right? But it takes like high school chemistry. Like, can you do paper chromatography? Okay, like you could distill ricin from castor beans, right? So I'm kind of like, with all of the drugs that we regulate so closely, with all of the poisons that we regulate so closely, right? Why is it that there's this incredibly toxic thing growing all over the West with no way of knowing who's harvesting it and what for, right? And so some of you might remember, do you remember like that series of like ricin related, like people sending like ricin powder to government buildings? Yeah, like that whole thing was like so weird to me, right? Like it was like a pretty big deal. And it was in the context of laws about trucking hours and how many hours, like, how many hours are you allowed to spend behind the wheel for the safety of other people on the road. But then like truckers were like very upset that this was like limiting like their ability to like cover large distances and get paid. So this is also weird because I've been digging into this as much as I can, but for what a huge thing it was like not something that was documented very well, or at least not in a very public way, right? So someone who is angry about this sent these ricin tainted letters to post offices and like politicians' offices and stuff. So you would think that this would be like some sort of national security crisis with people sending like a really potent poison to like federal buildings. I don't know. I guess I'm bringing this up because that seems like in that case, I don't know. Like, are we talking about castor bean in a way that is separate from the, I'll call it the immigration history of a plant? It seems more separate to me than, for example, the way that we talk about Himalayan blackberry, right? Like, another thing I think about is ice plant, right? Like, I mean, depending on the species, like either a food or a decorative plant that escaped. But I mean, one that like it causes some profound problems, like at least in like, I guess where I encountered this one is Southern California. And by encountered, I mean like removed massive carpets of Carpobrotus, right? And the reason for this was because people would plant it like on embankments as if it was going to stabilize them, which is like the world's worst idea because it's a plant that like takes up a whole bunch of water, right? Like, I mean, and so it became so heavy that it would actually like destabilize these slopes instead of stabilizing it. Okay, it would kind of creep and crawl down the slopes, and then like people like, like volunteer conservationists would have to go in and cart it away, which of course is like an immense labor because it's like just carrying like gallons and gallons and gallons of water in plant form off of the landscape, Was that tied to the immigration history of the plant? I don't know. I mean, maybe, but it was also like, at least it was couched in sort of like very geological terms. Not to say that geology is also sort of racially loaded, but it doesn't seem to have that sort of same dimension that this whole conversation about the Rubus genus has, right? Where the same reasons we have a problem with the invasive plant are the things that we tend to use in the way that we slander Asian Americans as model minorities. So I don't know if that makes sense. Maybe what I'm saying is the thing to avoid here is that sort of confluence of the sort of like sore spots in any sort of human population and the way that we would characterize plants from that same area. I think that's part of what pisses people off so much about this situation, and part of I go back to the Asian hornet thing that kind of kicked all of this off for me. I was just sort of like, oh, like the problem here is not that I object to giant hornets who stink and kill people being removed from our landscapes. That sounds great to me. My problem is that it coincided with this other thing. And so it seemed to me that when people were talking about eradicating giant hornets, it was this fantasy of eradicating the Asian Americans who were like COVID factors, right? So that became a whole nother kind of problem. And it seemed like as a starting point, if we kind of really try hard to avoid that kind of layered or metaphorical speech where the two are intended to coincide in these really pernicious ways, I wonder if we might have a little bit more wiggle room to figure out the rest.
Okay, I'm going to ask just a couple more. So Helen Hupp, who is of Scottish and English descent. She was talking about that she pulls a lot of Scots broom and English ivy and English laurel. And she says, I realize that these plants are not where I want them, and that they are named, what they're named is irrelevant, but usually she just calls them ivy, laurel, and broom. And she wonders if she's out of line, or is there, does that make sense to just kind of bring it back to not put those labels of some sort of country of origin or something like that?
Yeah, actually, you know what? I think that can be a helpful intervention, and I think it's one that's sort of kind of happening on a broad scale. So I think like absolutely, to like, as far as I'm concerned, as much as we can sort of modify the language while still communicating effectively with each other, I'm like, those all seem like really great interventions. you know, like, I think it does sort of like raise this other sort of like really interesting question. Well, we have so many European quote unquote invasives like in America as well, right? Like all of these, a lot of European food plants, a lot of European decorative plants. So I think this becomes another issue where you're just sort of like, well, what's the difference? You know, I raised the question of like, you know, what's the difference between like talking about Argentinian pampas grass versus talking about tamarisk or Himalayan blackberry. You know, I think you can extend that question to like, well, now what's the difference? You know, talking about Scotch broom, right? And I think again here, a lot of the issue has to be sort of like, okay, so where are the cultural sort of like sense, the cultural kind of like bruises, I guess, and how can we sort of like steer clear of those so as like not to inflame things? I think it's more complicated than that. Okay, so there were some slides that I put into this and then I took them back out again because I was like, no, that is once again a whole other door to walk through. But I sort of had this question, like not to wax political, I'm not here to polemicize, but I do have these questions about how sort of culture and ecology overlap. And I was thinking of like, you know, King County, sort of Seattle at its heart, and a sanctuary city and all of this. I just had this question of like, okay, like I wonder if a King County website languages invasive species like differently than the surrounding counties. And for whatever reason, it was Scotch broom that kind of came up as like, you know, and it might just have been an accident of composition, like whatever it is, but the language around Scotch broom was like really different for King County than for I think I was like looking for like a really sort of illustrative like other county, and the side by side I ended up with, out of all, I was like just Googling surrounding counties and then all different native plant species, and the side by side I had ended up with was King County versus Clackamas County in Oregon, the way that they presented Scotch broom. And to some degree here, like in that instance, I was like, because part of it was like, well, what does this country of origin, specific racial formation have to do with it? How far does that go? And how far is the conversation just about this is an exotic plant, it's from somewhere else, we don't care where? And so maybe I was pushing up against that limit there, where it did not seem like people cared where this was from. It was just like Scotch broom is not from here. But the language that was being used to describe Scotch broom was very much the language that would have been used to characterize Black and brown immigrants in America, right? So it's kind of like, well, that's not great language, but there's still not that confluence probably of sort of like discrimination in the human political sphere and discrimination in the ecological sphere, because it was like, oh, we're talking about like a European invasive, but almost in these sort of like, you know, Asian or like maybe Latinx discriminatory terms, right? And that might be different than talking about an Asian or like, you know, in Pampas grass, an Argentinian invasive, like in those same racialized terms, if that makes sense. But I mean, I guess like the rest of that story was just that in that tiny case study, which I imagined how cool it'd be to do this on a broad scale and like scrape this language from like the conservation district websites and stuff like all over the country, right? The language around the Seattle website was like so much, I think, more deliberately immigrant friendly than the language in Clackamas County, which was all about this sort of like really graphic eradication and get your families, get your wrenches, like do it while you can, get them while they're young before Scotch broom hardens and you can't get rid of it, you know? So when I was reading that website, look it up if you want to, it's kind of fascinating and horrifying and all sorts of things all at once, especially because it seems totally inadvertent, right? But that definitely read as racialized language to me. So did the Seattle entry. It was just racialized in a deliberately immigrant-friendly sense.
Okay, I'm going to wrap it up with one more comment. And actually, I'm going to combine 2 or 3 people's together. So one thought was, what would invasion ecology or restoration ecology look like without war or sports terminology and opponents. And then there's a couple others where they were throwing out some other words. They were talking about how words were very important. And someone suggested, how about instead of invasive or thug, use very vigorous, or someone else mentioned too vigorous or overly vigorous, and which I can always think of some native plants that are kind of like that too. But anyway, there's, and I noticed the competitiveness or whatever that gets in terminology a lot of times. So just maybe address that a little bit, not which is maybe slightly different than being racist, but terminology, but it's kind of the way we think of things, the good and the bad kind of stuff.
Right. So you've got me thinking of this other sort of recent panic in my professional life. I have a book coming out in a couple of months here from Kaya Press, which is like an Asian diasporic press. And sort of like in the sort of like lead up to publishing this book, my editor put me on this like panel of like prominent Asian American theorists. And the topic of the panel is like Asian politics and the end of metaphor. And I was just like called her in a panic and I was like, what have you done? Like, I have never uttered any of those words in that order. How can I be on this panel with people like expecting me to say something about this? What is this, right? And then as we started talking about it, I started thinking like, oh, because she was like, what are you talking about, Jenny? This is like what your whole project is about. This is your whole shtick, right? And I was like, oh, okay. I think we have to deal with this sort of really real question of, is the issue that we're using sporting language in a metaphorical sense? Are we using war language in a metaphorical sense? In which case, I think it would be possible to say, well, that's a problem with language. And I've actually run into this, actually some other contexts around sort of like, racially sensitive conservation that didn't have to do with native plants, where I was like, I was working with some collection of Klamath Valley tribes who had been like, can you take this language out? And I was like, yes. And then my white collaborators were like, well, what's a synonym? If we took that out, what word are we putting in instead? And I was like, well, I don't think that was the point. I think they wanted to dismantle the entire framework in which that word occurred, like not just find a synonym, right? So are we talking about the sort of figurative language where it's like, okay, we're not really talking about war, so let's not use the language of war. We're not really talking about sports. Let's not use the language of sports. Or is the problem that in a way that moves beyond metaphor, this is a war and it is a sport, right? And so I think that's where I'm just kind of like, oh, I don't know if you can tease those things apart. Maybe some of you could. I can't. And part of the sort of personal reason for that might be, like my family found its way to America because of war, a combination of the sort of Chinese Civil War and World War II. Like, and then in this sort of other dimension of my life, which sounds very weird to people who know me as a writer and a scholar, is that, gosh, I retired in 2017, just before I started like having my kids, but I had a long career as a professional cage fighter. So I have always been deep, and I've been doing martial arts since I was a little kid. I continue to like actively like train and compete in jujitsu. So for me, war and sport. Oh, and I went to college. So all those years of my education as an ecologist, I was at UC Irvine on a track scholarship. I was a steeplechaser. So my whole life, I think, is steeped in war and in sports, in an immediate family sense, in a professional sense. Like, grad students are poor. I made my living fighting people in the cage. Turns out it pays a lot better than teaching does. So I can't separate those things from each other, like not one little bit. That might be just me, but then my theoretical brain tells me that they're also probably inseparable, like on a global scale, right? Like climate. I mean, I think one of the big pieces underlying for me, the shift that's going to have to happen, not just because we're becoming better people and we're more aware of this, is that climate change is dramatically altering the world that we live in. It's changing which trees exist where, which animals move where, including human animals, right? The ground beneath our feet is going to become, I think, foreign to all of us very soon. And it's going to, whether we want to or not, there's going to be a reckoning here about what our relationship to species looks like. I think one of the books, did I put it on this list? Yes. This book is by Eben Kirksey, Emergent Ecologies. That's what this book is all about, right? Like what happens if we stop thinking of the Earth as this sort of place that has been sort of wrecked by human intervention. I mean, I think probably we all still think it's been kind of wrecked by climate change, but if we think of the sort of immigrations that emerge out of that as not artificial things that humans do in every instance, but as a sort of like natural responses to the changing circumstances that are happening for all of us, then maybe it opens some doors to think about this not as a war that we're having, but a sort of like coming to grips with a new reality in which all of us, even those of us who historically have had a sort of claim to hegemonic privilege, are going to find ourselves in sort of like disorienting and alien terrain.
Well, thank you so much. I was gonna say it was the last one, but Annette put in something that I thought was pretty good. She mentions that invasive species lists typically have a relationship to toxic plants that are toxic to livestock, and yet that livestock is possibly considered transplants that are maybe also invasive. So that's it's like a play. It's like a bouncing ball back and forth of which way you look at things, and context is always interesting. But maybe two conditions can be at the same time, in the same place, true, even though they're different points of view or something.
Yeah, so this dynamic, was really popularized because, decades ago now, I guess, John McPhee's Annals of the Former World was such a popular book when it came out, right? This idea of just like a sort of like cross section of America, like Highway 80, and sort of documenting like everything that's going on with the geology of the country and the way that impacts all of these other things. And so one of the things that shows up in that book is this conversation about like the sort of westward spread of asters and the way they like uptake selenium and then kill cattle, right? It's sort of like, oh, well, so yeah, you have this like situation where you have a species on new terrain and it's causing new problems in this context, but well, we're kind of all of two minds about this, I think. I'm like, well, like that's not great that it's killing cattle, but also cattle invasive. What do you do about this? Is this some sort of like shedding mechanism? I don't know, like how we want to think about all of that, but I think it's a sort of very real dynamic here for sure. Yeah.
Yes. Lots to think about. All right. I think we're good. So Annette did bring up the thing that to looking at herself, she's of European descent, and she was born here and she has English as her language that she speaks. And then does that make her automatically a racist? And I know that is probably a discourse for another time, because I think that opens up a whole great door. And I think it's a good conversation piece of like, where do we stand? How do we look at this terminology and words? And sometimes being challenged in ourselves, where do we fit in, and where are we in that part of the conversation?
Yeah.
So someone's thanking us for the good discussion, and I will ditto that. Thank you much for launching us down this path. And lot of people are having good references of other things that they are connecting with in various different ways. So I'll be sure and send you this chat.
Wonderful.
Deb, do you have any final comments on the night of the, I know at this point, just to let you know, I'm going to be, because you've not been able to use your microphones, I'm going to go be turning those on so that we can have some discussion towards the end. So just notice I think you're going to get questions if that's an okie dokie thing to do. So just be prepared for that next step.
Perfect.
All right. And
Okay, well, I just want to thank you, Jenny. That was incredibly thought-provoking. I'm going to be mulling this over for quite a while, and I really appreciate you bringing us down this path to look at what language we're using around these things. And yeah, so that's really fascinating. Thank you so much.
Thank you for providing the space for all of us to think about this together today.
Mm-hmm. So, yeah, so Gail, are you thinking we can, usually at this point, we stop the recording and talk about chapter stuff.
Deb,
But
this
did
is
you,
Kate.
what you
I'm
said was
here.
leave it open for discussion or what? What was your intent, Gail?
no, I think we can stop the recording if Denise is there. And